Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining our webinar on Justice Adapting the Law Societies of Northwest Territories, Nunavut, and Yukon. The presentation will begin momentarily. A few housekeeping notes. If anyone on the panel or in the audience experiences technical difficulties during the webinar, I suggest that you exit the meeting and re-enter it when possible using the link provided. This webinar will be recorded. LexisNexis will distribute a link to the recorded session in a timely manner. So if there is a bit of the webinar that you miss, you will receive the recording very soon. If you have any questions during today's webinar, please submit them using the chat function of the Zoom platform. We will collect all of the questions submitted by the audience and dedicate time at the end of the panel discussion to answer as many as possible. On behalf of LexisNexis Canada and the panel, we hope you are all keeping well during this unsettled time, and we thank you for doing your part to flatten the curve. As COVID-19 events continue to unfold, LexisNexis Canada is supporting the legal community by providing free legal news, analysis, and other key resources specifically geared to support your decision-making and counsel on COVID-19 matters. For example, the Lexis Practice Advisor Coronavirus landing page provides a document kit that can be downloaded for free. If you are a Lexis Practice Advisor user, you can access this information through the COVID-19 pod once you are logged in. The coronavirus landing page also links to the Lawyers Daily COVID-19 free legal news. Please visit lexisnexis.ca/COVID-19 for more information. Today's webinar will now begin. I'd like to introduce the moderator, Director of Subscription Content, Jay Breacher. His team is responsible for publishing more than 1,000 releases per year, including loose leafs, newsletters, law reports, and Halsbury's Laws of Canada. Jay has also authored several Halsbury's titles, and he is the co-founder of the Rule of Law Report. Now I'll ask everyone to turn on their cameras, and Jay, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Laura, and thank you to everyone who's joined us today. I'm very pleased to introduce our distinguished panelists. Firstly, we have John McLean, who is President of the Law Society of Nunavut and Director of the Nunavut Lawyers Assistance Program. John is also legal counsel in the Legal and Constitutional Law Division of the Nunavut Department of Justice. His practice is primarily in corporate and commercial law, with a focus on government procurement and major construction. Since the declaration of a public health emergency due to the pandemic, John has been the principal legal advisor to the government and to the Chief Public Health Officer respecting emergency powers. Secondly, I am pleased to introduce Glen Tate, who is the Executive Director and Deputy Secretary for the Law Society of the Northwest Territories. Glen established the Yellowknife office of McLennan Ross and was the managing partner of that office until he retired in December 2017, after practicing law in Alberta and the Northwest Territories for 35 years. He was the chair of the Discipline Committee of the Law Society for 8 years. He is familiar with all aspects of protection of the public interest and the regulation of lawyers. Finally, we have Mark Wallace, who is the president of the Law Society of the Yukon. Upon his call to the Manitoba Bar, Mark practiced with a major Winnipeg law firm in their civil litigation department, with a practice focused on corporate commercial litigation and construction litigation, including insurance defense. He continues to provide those same legal services since joining Ostring, Fairman, and Fekeda in 2013, where he carries on a general civil litigation practice, including personal injury, construction, mining, and commercial litigation. Now, without further ado, let's proceed with the first question to the panel. That is, what has been the general experience for your law society since the start of the COVID-19 crisis? John, let's start with you.
Well, in some cases, things have stayed the same. We are a largely non-resident law society. We have about 70 members of the Law Society are resident in the territory, and about 200 or so practicing outside of the territory. So a lot of our committee work happens over the phone and happens by email, happens electronically, and that's continued. But what has changed, our office is closed to the public. Some of our staff at the Law Society is working remotely. Some are coming to the office to make sure that we are available to the public, at least by phone and email. And we are continuing to meet by teleconference, and we're putting out guidance documents for members of the bar on how to navigate the process. But so it's, some things have stayed the same, some things are a little bit different.
All right, Glenn, what has been the experience for your Law Society?
Thanks, Jay. Well, it's caused us to look at some of our business processes. For example, our CPD program was previously all done in person with non-resident or people who weren't in Yellowknife attending by way of teleconference. We've moved that now to a Zoom platform, and that's enabled us to not only provide a greater service to our members, particularly our non-resident members, but it also allows us to now record those sessions so that we're building up slowly a bank of CPD sessions that our members are going to be able to review if they're not able to attend the in-person session. One of the other things it's done is we've made a conscious effort to reach out to our members, particularly our sole practitioners, who we initially thought would be our most vulnerable population. I've been in contact with most of them twice since the pandemic started, just to check in, just to see how they were doing. And they're faring very well, and I'm pleased to hear that. The other thing that we've done just recently is we're surveying our members to find out if there are any other issues that they have that we're not aware of that they'd like us to advance for the government. But like John, many of our processes have stayed the same. Our office hasn't been closed, although our landlord locked the door. We made arrangements for the public to come in. The bulk of our public contact is through the telephone, and so if the public was phoning, they wouldn't notice any difference because we continue to be able to function and provide services to the public that way.
All right, and Mark, what has been the experience for the Law Society of the Yukon?
Well, like the other two, some things have changed, a lot hasn't. Our office has remained open. The door typically is left open, but right now it's closed. There's staff in the office answering the phone. The public and members can come in. As restrictions have been easing, we've been planning and moving towards expecting more people to come into the office. We've put up a plexiglass barrier. We've marked out physical distancing on the floor. Our ED has been in contact with most of the sole practitioners in the territory, just checking in on them. Much like Northwest Territories, we thought they would be the most vulnerable, but they surprised us. They had taken many steps before we'd even contacted them. We continue to identify issues that we perceive as potential bars to either the public accessing legal services or our members, and we give directions to the members to assist with that. That's pretty much what we've been doing.
All right, let's stick with you, Mark, to begin to answer my next question, which is, have you received a lot of requests for support from your members? And if so, what kinds of support have lawyers been seeking?
Generally, we haven't received a lot of requests for support. We've got a small local bar, much like the other two. Within practice areas, they tend to know each other and work well together. Where we have received concerns raised by our members, it's been more forward-looking, potential problems down the road, such as swearing documents, limitation dates, whether specific government offices would remain open. And as the Law Society, we've raised these concerns with the government to try and alleviate some of those concerns. The government has acted on many of the issues that we've raised, although I suspect they had those on their radar before we raised them.
All right, and John, same question for you. What kinds of, if any, requests for support from your members have you received?
We've had some general questions early on, as just what Mark was saying about swearing documents, about executing things, because we had very strict social distancing guidelines and orders in the early days of pandemic. As of Monday, the social distancing guidelines are going to be increased to groups of 25 people outdoors, and it'll still be 5 people inside. But there was one early question about how can people get married when there need to be, the spouses to be, the 2 witnesses, and the officiant. Well, that's a gathering, and how can you avoid a $575 fine for that? So we were able, in one case, to redirect those questions to the Chief Public Health Officer's office, but we issued some guidelines on remote execution of documents and signing of things. Also, we've been in touch with the people at my day job at the Department of Justice about how to work together on some of the electronic document questions. We've had a few interesting questions about accommodations around bar exams and around people who need to get called to the bar here. You need to be physically present in the territory to get called, and currently the borders are restricted, and you have to spend 14 days in quarantine before even traveling to Nunavut, and even if you did that, the court is closed. So we had to come up with a plan where we issued restricted appearance certificates so people could continue practicing the laws of Nunavut without breaking the law, pending their call. So we've been handling questions as an executive as they come in, and I think thus far everything has been addressed.
All right, and finally, Glen, what sort of requests, if any, have you received in the Northwest Territories?
Jay, we've received very few. Our membership renewal process runs from January until March. And so with the pandemic coming in mid-March, we got some requests from our non-resident members, particularly those in Alberta who were forced out of their offices, saying, look, we need a little bit more time in order to complete our renewal process. And we accommodated that. But those are really the only requests for support we've received.
Okay, Glen, we'll stick with you to answer first the next question, which is, did you have to make any changes to the Bar Association fees or CPD to support lawyers in their practice?
Thanks, Jay. As I say, our renewal process was ongoing. The deadline was March 31st. And as a result of these requests we received, we extended the deadline for 2 weeks to allow members an additional time to complete the renewal process. The other thing that our executive has done is they've made the decision to hold the mandatory insurance levy at the same rate it was last year. The Law Society is going to absorb the increased costs that are passed on to from our insurer and not pass those on to the membership. With respect to CPD, we initially ceased providing CPD sessions because our CPD sessions were typically all provided through in-person sessions. However, as I say, we've shifted to the Zoom process now, and we're in fact discovering that there's a much greater uptake for CPD, providing it through that platform. So we're endeavoring to launch more programs and have a more robust CPD program. Those are the things that we've done.
Okay, and Mark, what if any changes have you made in your jurisdiction?
Our membership fees were due at the end of January, so there was no reduction there. We've had a few requests regarding CPD reduction in those hours. We have not agreed to that. CPD hours have remained constant. Our CLE committee is looking to put online CPD credits, and they're working hard on that. We've also been directing members to outside sources for CPD. A lot of our members do travel outside the territory for larger conferences. Those aren't happening, so we're trying to lend a hand there.
All right, and John, any changes to fees or CPD in Nunavut?
We had just gotten through the renewal process, and serendipitously, this was the first year we moved to online renewals and electronic transfer of payments. So that worked remarkably well, and that was just finishing up as the pandemic hit. So there haven't been requests for changes on fees. We have been temporarily waiving the restricted appearance certificate certificate fee for people who have already applied to be members of the Nunavut Bar and have paid the membership fee, but can't get called to the bar yet. With respect to continuing professional development, you have to love the Law Societies of Canada, because when there's a crisis, we help each other out. And our friends at the Law Society of Alberta have opened up their platform for us so we can do some more tailored targeted webcast CPD. A lot of our professional development at the Law Society was over the phone by teleconference, so we're going to continue doing that. We typically have a professional development event tied in with our annual general meeting. That's going to be postponed. This year, we were supposed to have a presentation from the Federation of Law Societies, which will just have to be put off. And unfortunately for me, I've been part of the organizing committee for a one-day lawyer mental health CPD session, in-person workshop on resiliency and compassion fatigue. And that's been in the works for months and months, and it was supposed to be April the 3rd, and that was right in the middle of travel restrictions. So we will be holding that at some future date, as yet to be determined. So no changes to the number of hours required. Some of the methods may change, and we'll do what we can to make sure our members can meet their hours within territory if they're not able to travel this year.
All right, we'll stay with you, John, to begin the next question. Did you have to put in place any special initiatives for your members during the pandemic, considering the challenge they're facing in their practice?
We have not, and we haven't been asked. Our finances are not exactly of a robust position that we could provide financial support. Certainly, support in terms of resources and referral to resources, we're certainly open to providing and willing to connect people with potential sources of help and support. And we are certainly open to receiving feedback and suggestions from the membership on that. But as thus far, no.
All right. And Glen, what about in your jurisdiction? Any special initiatives?
We're very much the same, Jay. We haven't heard anything from our members about any financial hardships. And I think this would probably be the same for Nunavut and the Yukon as well, but given that our lawyers are typically centralized in the larger communities and have a practice that involves clients in the smaller communities, issues like getting documents signed remotely and dealing with client identification and verification when your client is in a different location are issues that we have worked through already. And so we already had processes in place for that. So that part continued on. And again, I'm looking forward to hearing what our members say in response to the recent poll we have out to see if there are any other issues that they think we can be assisting them with.
All right. And Mark, what about in your jurisdiction?
No, we haven't put in any special practices at the moment.
Okay. And John already touched on the matter of in terms of any kind of financial assistance and how that may not simply be viable, but Mark, have you considered creating a program to financially assist lawyers for whom COVID-19 has been most impactful?
We haven't, although what we did do was we've spaced out the CLIA payments over 3. Typically we offer 2 payments, but we've spaced it over 3. If there's cash flow issues with some of the firms and some of the sole practitioners, then this should help, or we're hopeful that this will help. And remain optimistic that that's all we'll need to do, but we'll see what comes up.
And Glen, what about in your jurisdiction?
Well, again, we haven't had any requests for financial assistance. We did agree to hold the insurance payment, the CLIA payment that Mark referred to, at the 2,000 level as a benefit to the members. That's what we've done.
Okay. And John, I guess you already addressed that issue. You don't have anything further to add?
Not at the moment, no. And we have been fairly flexible historically in providing people with grace periods and with time where there are fees coming due. Deadlines are deadlines for sure, but we have been certainly flexible upon request for assistance when people have been facing financial hardship in other years. So I don't see why we'd be willing to change that.
All right. Okay, our next question for the panel. Did you have to learn or use new software or technology or use new communication methods such as social media, websites, podcasts, etc., in order to keep connected with your members? Mark, let's start with you on that one.
Yeah, we have, and like most of our members, we're getting used to the new technology. One of the things that we did most recently, or had to look at most recently, was whether we could conduct electronic voting for the executive election. It turned out it wasn't needed, but we looked into that. We're starting to use Zoom for meetings now, primarily internally, although once we get the kinks worked out, we will probably expand that for a meeting with members and such. We've also been very cautious about inundating our members with emails. Our concern is if they start receiving too many emails from the Law Society, they'll start ignoring them. So what we've done, we for 6 months or so, we've been talking about using our website as an information hub, with postings on there for the members to look at, as well as the public. And we've advanced that schedule, and we've now got a fair number of postings from the court, from the Information Privacy Commissioner, as well as directed from us to the members, so that we're not overwhelming our members with emails.
All right, John, what about the use of new software or technology in your jurisdiction?
We have certainly, we rolled out our new website this year around Christmas time, so that continues to be a primary medium of communication, as does the weekly email blast from our administrator to the membership, keeping people up to date with upcoming professional development and different deadlines, different things. We will be doing certain things by teleconference, which is nothing new for us. We did seriously look at electronic voting for the executive elections this year. And I think we're going to proceed with that anyway, even though there is not a rush because our executive was elected by acclamation this year. But we're probably going to go ahead with it anyway, just because the current system has often had its problems simply if the mail gets delayed with mail-in ballots. So we're moving electronic that way, I think, long term. And the other challenge with us, of course, is bandwidth. That in Nunavut, we are the last place in Canada with no fiber optic connection to the rest of the world. We are entirely dependent on satellites. We are entirely dependent on communication, and our members out in the communities that aren't Iqaluit do not have the same level of internet connectivity that we do. So we have to be very careful when we choose a new platform or we choose new technology that it will actually work and will work in our limited bandwidth. So the phone tends to work best for us. But although from our communication so far today, I don't want to jinx it, but it seems to be working okay. So some of the video conferencing platforms are getting better, and we may be looking at those sort of over the long term, so we can actually see each other when we have our conversations.
Right, and Glenn, what about in the Northwest Territories?
Jay, I joked that on March the 12th, I had no idea what Zoom was. And now I write primers for people on how to attend Zoom meetings. So we embraced the Zoom technology, both for committee meetings, for our executive meetings, and as I said, for CPDs. I had to learn about YouTube so we could create a YouTube channel so we could put those CPDs up so that our members could see them. And not a new technology at all, but we did a couple of things around communication. I spoke already about reaching out to our sole practitioners. I also send out a newsletter typically once a month. I've increased the frequency of that to at least twice a month. And I've included in it interesting articles that we've found out, for example, how to best conduct Zoom meetings, articles on federal and other government programs that lawyers should be participating in. One of the articles I found from the Harvard Business Review was how to lead through anxiety, which had a great uptake. And I've also made a point of including physical and mental health resources in the newsletter, so that and acknowledging that these are trying times for all of us, and here are some resources that are available should you want to make use of them.
All right, let's stay with you, Glenn, for the next question. How are you going to manage this year's annual general meeting? Is there a need for elections this year? And if so, how are you going to manage them?
Sure. There will be elections this year, but we're ahead of some other law societies. I think for several years now, we've engaged online voting for exactly the reasons that John identified. The alternative is mail-in ballots, which takes an awful long time and ballots get lost. So we've had good success with electronic voting. If the current restrictions continue, I envision that we'll have our annual general meeting in December virtually, or if the restrictions are lifted, perhaps, it may be a hybrid where some people can attend in person and the rest attend virtually by Zoom. That's how I envision it happening, at least at this point.
And Mark, what's the situation in the Yukon?
As far as our AGM, it's been postponed. Hopefully, group sizes will be allowed soon enough that we can hold an in-person AGM. If not, because our act requires in-person voting, we will need an order in council to either allow for a virtual meeting or to postpone the meeting until group sizing would allow for it. Elections, we had prepared to do mail-in ballots again. We had looked at the option of electronic voting, but our rules don't allow for it. Although, like John, now that we've looked into it, I think we're going to be looking for a rule amendment in the not too distant future to allow for it. Our executive was acclaimed this year, so it's not a concern until next.
And John in Nunavut?
Our AGM is typically a bit of a hybrid in that we have people gathering in a hotel conference room in Iqaluit and lots of people joining from across the country and various parts of Nunavut on the phone. This year, all of us will be joining by the phone, and it will be a very, very short meeting. We have boiled it down to just the essentials of approving the financial statements, receiving the statutory obligation reports, appointing the auditors, and moving on. There are no resolutions before the council this year thus far, but we have committed, because we have some rule amendments we'd like to pursue, basically to ratify electronic voting, among other things, but there are some changes to the articling program, and there are some changes to some various rules, the model rules the Federation of Law Societies has encouraged the law societies to ratify. We were supposed to do this year. We've committed to having an in-person meeting in the fall as soon as we're allowed to have one again. Because quorum for our annual general meetings is 12 and the size limit on meetings is 5. So we're currently going to have to hold off on the in-person meetings for now, and we're going to have a telephone business meeting later in June. And then once the new executive is brought on board, we can start making plans. 2 of us were elected last year for 2-year terms. We have 2 new people acclaimed, and we have a designated public member who was appointed. So we have the 2. We didn't have to have elections this year, so we didn't have to try out that new electronic voting system just yet, but next year.
All right, and staying with you, John, for the next question. How are you doing your part to protect the public during the pandemic? Did you have to put any special measures in place?
We have we have our very first disciplinary hearing coming up. Actually, I think it's our second hearing, but it's among our first disciplinary hearings, which normally the legal profession access, they have to be open to the public, and we're not allowed to have public meetings right now. The generosity of one of our law firms has led to us having that meeting via webcast for the first time. And members of the public can sign up and can get an invitation to join and be a participant in that discipline process. So that's the first time we've ever done that. We have put out some guidance documents for the bar and by extension to the public on remote execution of documents and other things, but we've also made it perfectly clear that our complaints line is still open and our non-complaints line is still open. So if anyone wants to contact the Law Society, we are still available, even if the office is closed to the public.
All right, Glenn, what's your experience in terms of doing your part to protect the public?
Jay, most of our contact with the public comes through lawyer referral. We run the lawyer referral service for the NWT, and the bulk of that happens by telephone. And because we haven't had to close our office, if you phoned in looking for a lawyer, you would not notice any difference. And although I think I said our office is opened, although the landlord until this past week had the door locked, we made arrangements. We posted a notice that said if anybody wanted to come in, they could see us. We made a few slight modifications to the office to make sure that we maintain physical distancing. And so if members of the public did want to drop by, they could. And we continued to provide the same level of service that we did post-pandemic.
All right. And Mark, what about in the Yukon?
Our office has remained open to the public, so there hasn't been an interruption in service. There has been an uptick in phone calls coming in from the public as opposed to walk-ins. Overall access has remained the same. We've done our best to help support the bar through outreach, ensure that everyone's doing okay, as well as providing guidance to the membership through our website and through phone calls as needed.
All right, staying with you, Mark, to answer the next question. How are you doing your, do you think that virtual law practices carried on by your members during the pandemic will have some lasting effect on the way that law is practiced going forward?
I think it will. Some of the things that have been done during the pandemic, I think, are best described as stopgap, and those will likely drop off once business returns to normal. Others I see as more, they were in the works, slowly but surely moving forward. And the uptake has been increased, video conferencing, video meetings, that sort of thing, as well as electronic filing with our court. I think a lot of those are going to stick around. My word of caution to anyone out there, obviously as a lawyer, you have to look at what's in the best interest for your client as far as technology goes, and be cautious of what technology you adopt.
All right, and John, what are your thoughts about virtual law practices?
I think it's going to be interesting. I think now that we've proven that we can work from home, I think some of the larger institutional employers may have to stop the notion that it's impossible and we can't possibly and don't even think about asking for it. So I think that'll change. I think what we've shown even with our own systems at my work, that once you have the electronic document management, you can practice anywhere. So it's some of the benefits to having a virtual practice might actually assist people get set up in some of our smaller communities. If you don't need a storefront office anymore and you don't need a whole closet to put your files in, if everything is electronic and they're backed up to a cloud, I think we've got a cohort of 23 to 25 articling students coming through the Nunavut Law Program in the next years or so, and some of them have expressed interest in going to small communities to start legal practices, and that's fantastic. I think some of our experience from the pandemic might actually help them. And it'll be incumbent upon us as a law society to come up with rules that don't hinder that, but do make sure that we're protecting the public and that privacy is protected and that people are living up to the code of professional conduct with respect to know your client and identification and verification. So we also have to make sure that people practicing law in Nunavut are licensed to practice law in Nunavut. So we'll see how that goes.
All right, and Glenn, what are your thoughts about virtual law practices in the Northwest Territories?
Jay, I very much agree with Mark. I mean, I've heard from both sole practitioners and those in firms saying that this whole pandemic has caused us to rethink, in the case of the sole practitioner, whether or not they actually need a brick and mortar office or whether they can work from home. And in the case of a firm, whether they need the footprint that they have. How many meeting rooms do they need? How many offices do they actually need? I really wouldn't want to be a commercial landlord, because I think that not just lawyers, but I think businesses in general are starting to realize that they can work virtually just as well without the bricks and mortar footprint. So I think a lot of what we're seeing is going to stay, and I think a lot of people are realizing that it's a benefit to them.
All right, and building on that, starting with you, Glenn, what other impacts do you think the situation will have on the legal community in the future?
Well, it's almost the same answer, Jay. I really think the biggest change is going to be more of a move to virtual law practices. Our lawyers, the lawyers in Nunavut, the lawyers in the Yukon already have experience in dealing with clients in remote communities, and I spoke a little bit about that already. They're used to that, and they're realizing now that they can have that same level of contact with their clients at home. The pandemic may have in fact caused them to find new ways to contact with their client. I mean, a lot of people are using Zoom, but like John, we have the same problem in a lot of our communities, that we just don't have bandwidth, and we don't have clients who may have access to Zoom technology. So where you can use it, great. Where you can't, you're going to be stuck using the old style phone contact. But I really think that's going to be the biggest impact we're going to see going forward coming out of the pandemic.
All right, Mark, your thoughts on that?
I agree. There are technologies that I hope get picked up as far as what lawyers and the courts use. I'd like to see an increase in electronic filings, electronic systems for lawyers, for the public. Cloud-based storage for law firms makes a lot of sense up here, as does Zoom meetings. Unlike the other two territories, our communities do, for the most part, have a better internet connection than some. So Zoom technology is a possibility where the client has that. I would love to see where the courts move more electronically. Simple small claims matters being dealt with by video conferencing from the communities would open up access to the public greatly. And I think our members are prepared to embrace that as well. So, yeah.
All right, and John, your thoughts about other lasting impacts of this situation on the legal community?
Well, I think, and I certainly hope that the court here will ramp up its efforts. We do have rudimentary electronic filing already. We have been able to teleconference into court for as long as I've worked here. And since the pandemic, they have kept going with emergency matters or short notice matters over the phone. But circuit courts, which are the lifeblood of the Nunavut Court of Justice, are currently on hold for the indefinite future. And the reality of some of our criminal and family clients is they don't have phones, let alone computers. So I think there will be a lot of proceed with caution with some of the with the move to electronic. Also, we have official languages considerations in Nunavut, where 85% of the population is Inuit, and we're the only territory in Canada where the primary language of communication is neither English nor French. So that's going to cause some interesting questions and some interesting considerations, particularly since the court is an arm of government and has official language act obligations. So I'm interested to see how that goes. I think we'll probably see some changes to some corporate commercial transactions. We might see some standards coming on electronic documents and some further guidance or legislative amendments on that. I think I wouldn't be surprised if we saw that in the next weeks, months, years. And I'm also really going to be interested to see how the electronic practice continues. And I've been a fan of it all along, but I've lived in a low bandwidth jurisdiction for long enough to know that it isn't entirely as seamless as one might hope it would be. So we'll it's a wait and see, and we'll proceed with caution. And as a law society, we don't want to get in the way. We want to help out, we want to support, and we want to make sure the public is protected, most importantly. So I'm not going to tell you which computer program to use so long as you are abiding by the rules of the Law Society.
Right. Okay, at this point, we have some questions posed by some of the registered participants in this webinar. The first one, we'll start again with you, John. Do you envision an impact on the articling process resulting from the pandemic? Do you think that fewer firms will offer articling positions?
We don't know, is the short answer to that question. We don't typically have more than 6 articling students in the run of a year in Nunavut anyway, although next 2021-22, we might have a very large cohort going through for when the Nunavut Law program graduates its class, and we're already laying the groundwork for that. With the current group of articling students coming in, there may be some difficulties doing the in-person sessions for the bar admission program. We, like many of the other jurisdictions in Canada, use CPLED. The new program, CPLED Prep, starts this year. So that'll be a dry run year for this anyway. But the in-person sessions, it'll be interesting to see how they run. And although we did have a student write the bar exam this week without incident or issue, so that was fine. And we've opened up and we've allowed remote supervision, because with people working from home, you still have to be able to get your work done and complete your 12-month articling term. So if you're reporting to your supervisor through a web chat or through email, we're satisfied with that.
All right. Glenn, what are your thoughts about potential impacts on the articling process?
Well, Jay, one of the challenges we have in the NWT, unrelated to COVID, is that for many years now, it's been very difficult to get an article in the NWT. We have very few students. And because of that, I don't think the pandemic is going to change any of that. I think that the institutions and the firms that hire students will still hire them. With respect to the process, we too participate in the CPLED, or what is now the PrEP program, administered through the Alberta Law Society and the other law societies. I understand that they're taking steps now to recognize that the in-person programs may be more difficult to administer, and they're going to have to be finding ways to accommodate those who can't get down. Because as I think John mentioned previously, we have the same problem. Anybody who leaves the territory and comes back is required then to go into quarantine for 14 days, which is a disincentive for you to be leaving the territory.
Right. And Mark, your thoughts about the articling process?
I think it is going to have an impact on the articling process, at least for this year coming up in the Yukon. All of our students go down to BC to participate in the PLTC program, which is a block time period. It's run a few times a year, but like the other two, coming back to the Yukon, you have to quarantine for 14 days. So that's a major disincentive. As well, the law firms that are typically hiring articling students are still trying to figure out what's happening as far as the market goes. I don't know that they're going to be looking to hire an articling student this year. Some of them may, but I think there's reduced articling positions available.
Okay, Mark, we'll stay with you for the next question. How do you envision the reopening of the courts with the backlog of cases that will need to be heard? Is there a lot of communication between the Law Society, the courts, and the government to determine how best to proceed?
There's been some communication between the Law Society and the courts on an as-needed basis. There's been a fair bit of communication between us and the government of the Yukon. As far as reopening, the courts haven't shut down here. They've continued. There's been limited to no in-person hearings, although case management conferences, contested applications have gone ahead by phone. For criminal matters, there's an in-house video system that's been utilized, although there hasn't been any jury trials, obviously, or any trials civilly or in family either. One of the biggest issues for us in dealing with whatever backlog there will be is our Chief Justice is retiring this summer, so we'll be down to two judges, Supreme Court judges, and 3 territorial court judges. We're likely to rely heavily on deputy judges. Those are judges that travel to the territory from other jurisdictions to deal with conflicts or just backlogs. I did have a brief conversation with someone at the court yesterday. There was almost no backlog going into this, so they're hopeful that having kept not only the ongoing files moving forward through case management, the registry stayed open for filing new claims, starting matters. They're hopeful that the backlog is going to be fairly limited. I think where there will be is criminal, particularly in the territorial court system. And the courts have come up with a couple of plans to help alleviate that, including they're going to have 1 week set aside to deal with fairly short matters in the criminal system. And they're hoping to get through 20 to 40 criminal matters in that week. So hopefully that'll deal with it. The one aspect that might be a little bit different in the Yukon than elsewhere is we have judicially assisted dispute resolution system here. And that hasn't taken place. Speaking with family law practitioners, that from the private bar, that's one of the largest service that they take from the court is the dispute resolution. There will be a backlog there that'll take time to alleviate. As I mentioned earlier, though, the local bar it works fairly well together. The lawyers have been working together to move matters forward, both civilly and civilly.
All right, John, what are your thoughts about reopening of the courts and dealing with the backlog?
Our courts have been closed to non-urgent matters since March. The Chief Justice recently extended the closure till July the 3rd. So any matter that was coming due or had been scheduled during the closure time is due that first week of July. I don't know that I would want to be in the court that first week of July. I think it will be something like the circus in town. But there's going to be backlog in the sense that we haven't had jury trials. We haven't had in-person matters since the winter. Court circuits are still a big question mark. We don't know when they'll be resuming again. And we rely, as Mark was saying, very heavily on deputy judges in the event of conflict or event of backlog. But those deputy judges come up here at the permission of their Chief Justice. And we're anticipating a backlog in the provinces as well. So those deputy judges may not be available. In fact, there may be that rarely used power in the Nunavut Act where senior members of the bar are appointed as ad hoc deputy judges to hear single matters. So we don't know if that's going to happen or not, but it has been talked about. In some respects, we've been set up already for video court simply because the courthouse was built in 2006 and it was wired for it to begin with. So in custody matters have been proceeding by video link to the correctional facility all along throughout this, and I think that'll continue. If the Chief Justice decides that we can open the court again for in-person matters and have counsel present in the courtrooms, the gallery may remain closed or may remain limited. There was talk at one point of having the audio only, a broadcast on YouTube, which could be an interesting Canadian first. So whether that'll happen or not, we will of course have to see. So it's going to be interesting. The other fly in the ointment, for want of a better expression, is in some provinces, the emergency powers legislation has allowed the cabinet to suspend the Limitations Act and civil limitation periods. Our legislation doesn't have the power to do that. So limitation periods, the court has discretion to waive or to modify, but we'll see how that plays out, or if the Legislative Assembly chooses to amend the Limitation of Actions Act to account for the pandemic and other sort of declared emergencies. So that'll be something to watch.
All right, and Glenn, how do you envision the navigating of reopening the courts?
Well, Jay, the NWT courts, the two of them, the Supreme Court and the Territorial Court, have been, I think, going above and beyond already to try and do as much as they can in these times. Like my colleagues have talked about, there are phone applications going on. Chambers applications are continuing. People in custody are being dealt with through video link. There are limited in-person processes. I'm certain that they're going to be working extra hard. Like the other jurisdictions, we don't have the circuits going on now, and that's where the backlog's going to be. I agree with Mark that the backlog is principally going to be on the criminal side. With respect to communications, we have robust bench and bar committees, both for civil and criminal matters, both for the Supreme Court and the Territorial Court. And my expectation would be that the courts may well be calling upon those folks as the proxies for the membership to have discussions with them as things unfold. I'm not sure, and we're very much in the same position as everyone else. I think everything that isn't going on is not going on until sometime in July, and whether or not that gets extended is at this point anybody's guess.
All right. Staying with the theme of the courts, and this is something you've already touched upon, but we have a question about the use of virtual court hearings. What has been the extent of or issues that you see raised by the prospect of virtual court hearings at this time? Glenn, let's start with you.
Sure. Like the other law societies, we have very few discipline hearings, which is a good thing. We don't have anything coming up, so we haven't had to cross that bridge. I know that there have been some administrative tribunals who have been conducting hearings virtually, and the court's limited experience has been more with respect to teleconference than with respect to virtual hearings. So there's been very little of that going on here.
All right. Mark, what about in the Yukon?
To date, very little has gone on virtually. It has been teleconferencing as far as the courts go. We have not had a hearing at the Law Society. I understand some administrative tribunals have proceeded by way of teleconference. I'm sure some have used video conference, but none that I've heard of.
And John, what about in Nunavut?
The court, their primary mode of communication is the phone and the teleconference, and they've certainly been using that throughout the pandemic, and I think that'll continue. The Law Society, as I mentioned earlier, we have a discipline hearing next month, which will be done by video conference, which will be a first for us. So we are maintaining our open to the public requirement that way. And with the Human Rights Tribunal, I know has done some mediation, some preliminary matters by Zoom, so that it is being used, at least in some capacity, in the administrative tribunal space, or either Zoom or Microsoft Teams or one of the platforms that are being used. So how long the pandemic goes and how long the travel restrictions are in place, I think will affect just how many of the electronic hearings proceed. Because if you have to spend 14 days in the hotel quarantine before coming up here, it's not really going to be an impetus to move up, particularly if you're a lawyer and would be billing for that time. So it creates an access to justice issue in itself. So if we get back up and running in July or even in the fall, I think we'll return to meeting in person wherever possible. I know some of the environmental assessment hearings under the land claim and under the Nunavut Project Planning and Assessment Act. So the Nunavut Impact Review Board has suspended hearings because the parties did not consent to appearing by teleconference. So that's an open question. There's supposed to be community hearings, and those are currently all on hold because of the travel restrictions. And so we'll see where those go.
Sticking with the theme of being open to the public, we've also received a question about requests from journalists to attend hearings during the pandemic. John, is that something which has occurred in Nunavut?
To my knowledge, no, but I know for the Law Society, if a journalist wants to attend the disciplinary matter, they would just have to RSVP and get an invitation to the meeting. We wouldn't say no to that.
Glenn, is that an issue that's arisen in the Northwest Territories?
Not with respect to the Law Society, Jay, because again, we haven't had any hearings. I know with respect to both the Supreme Court and the Territorial Court, the directions given by both courts make specific provisions for media attendance to ensure that those court processes continue to be open to the public, and particularly to journalists.
All right. And Mark, what about in the Yukon?
Any of the teleconference hearings through the court that would typically be open to the public are still open to the public. They just have to make a request. I don't know if the media has made any requests, but my conversation with the court, they're certainly able to join in.
All right. Also, there was a question about how the conditions of the pandemic have affected each of your own work routines, whether it's by not coming into an office or anything else about your day-to-day practice. Mark, let's start with you.
At the start of the pandemic, I started to work from home. My kids are at home. My wife was at home for a period of time. I'm now back in the office, thankfully. Not that I don't like my wife or my kids, but it's much easier to work from the office than from home, at least in my practice.
All right. And John, how about yourself?
I'm one of those people who's designated essential, so I have been reporting to work, but most of my colleagues are working from home. That's the government-wide, but definitely in the legal and constitutional branch. We're normally a very chatty, very friendly, very open office, and it's very, very quiet there these days. I think you can say that our business casual dress code has gone full casual because our offices are currently closed to the public. So that's changed. I do come home for video conferences and for other things, just simply because certain bandwidth works better on your home system than at work. But for the most part, the nature of the advice I've been giving has changed. That just about everything in our office has a pandemic flair to it now, whether that's support to essential business or whether that's advice to the chief public health officer or the labor and employment questions that come up directly connected to pandemic. So our office has kind of been all pandemic all the time for the last couple of months, and we're still, of course, answering questions on things that aren't related to the pandemic. So that's changed. And of course, there's a lot of uncertainty as to how long any of this is sustainable. And will we get to travel again and not have to go through quarantine and other questions like that? So I think longer hours and more teleconferences, I think, has been the theme of my last couple of months.
All right. And yourself, Glenn?
Well, I had the misfortune of being outside the territory when the borders were closed, so I had to go through a self-imposed 14-day quarantine. I was lucky enough to be able to work from home, so nothing much changed. I think, though, what I'm missing, and I've mentioned this to some of the members in the newsletters that I've written, is I've missed the interaction that we can't have anymore with our members just dropping by, coming in to rent our rooms, coming in to attend CPD sessions. And I think a number of people are experiencing that as well. And that's one of the challenges is the isolation and the monotony that comes from what we're experiencing now.
All right. I see a question that came through the chat directed to John. It said your comment just now regarding the suspension of EAs during the pandemic is of particular interest to me as counsel for YESAB. A quick Google didn't yield any results. If you have a moment, can you direct me to where I might find additional information regarding that?
I think your first choice, this is not my area of practice, but my first recommendation, look to the Impact Review Board website for matters in Nunavut, because they're very good at posting notices of what's been suspended and what hasn't. I know there were stories in the CBC and in the Nunatsiaq about the ongoing hearings. The one I'm thinking of is related to the Baffin Land Iron Mines application in North Baffin. So definitely check to the NERB website, Nunavut Impact Review Board, for that, or for the regulator of your in your jurisdiction. And there's also, it's never a bad idea to pick up the phone and give people a call, either to say what's the status of hearings and matters.
All right, well, we're at the top of the hour. Thank you to everyone who's joined us today, including our panelists. The link to this webinar recording will be available soon and will be sent to all of the registered participants. A big thank you again to our panelists for your time and important guidance during this event. On behalf of LexisNexis Canada, thank you and stay safe.
Thank you, Jay.
You.
Thank you.
Take care.